So, as reported in the Washington Post, longtime PGA Tour Policy Board member Randall Stephenson has resigned his position due to serious concerns about the recent framework agreement with the Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia to create a for-profit entity alongside LIV Golf and the DP World Tour with the PGA Tour. Stephenson, the longtime chair and CEO of AT&T, submitted his letter of resignation to the 9 other policy board members because the deal is, quote, not one that I can objectively evaluate or in good conscience support, particularly in light of the U.S. intelligence report concerning Jamal Khashoggi in 2018. Stephenson continued, I hope as the board moves forward, it will comprehensively rethink its governance model and keep its options open to evaluate alternative sources of capital beyond the current framework agreement. So some very strong words from Randall Stephenson. The Washington Post also reported that Stephenson planned to submit his resignation from the board 6 days after the agreement was announced back in June 6th, but waited after PGA Tour Commissioner Jay Monahan took leave to deal with that medical situation. The tour announced Friday that Monahan plans to return to work on July 17th. And this letter was sent to the PGA Tour members. We want to notify you that Randall Stephenson has resigned from his position on the PGA Tour Policy Board. Please join us in thanking Randall for his exemplary service to the organization and dedication to you, the membership, for more than 12 years. So, Eamon, your reaction to the news?
It certainly raises the temperature a little bit for tomorrow's hearings, because since no one from the Saudi side of this arrangement is going to be testifying, because both Yasser al-Rumayyan from the investment fund and Greg Norman from LIV had declined invitations to testify in front of this subcommittee, it was less likely, I think, that we were going to see anything related to the morality question coming up, and more likely to see questions that were very much focused on the idea of, are there antitrust concerns here? And Randall Stephenson has basically planted a flag in the sand here and made it a moral issue, that he could not objectively look at this deal based on the conduct of those who are on the other side of this deal, when we're literally talking about the people who carved up Jamal Khashoggi and ordered that murder. But I think it's easy to get fixated on that aspect of it. That's the least interesting part of the letter in its own way. He said that the PGA Tour board needs to reassess its governance. There's no way to interpret that as anything other than a broadside at Jimmy Dunne and Ed Hurley, the chairman of the board, who are the 2 men who architected this deal with Jay Monahan. And he also referred to keeping an open mind towards alternate financing out there. And there's at least one other player member on the board who's got a similar mindset on that as well. And this idea that this ought not to be the road they go down. Unfortunately, this was the side that was suing them. So that's why you end up cutting a deal with the Saudis. But it definitely complicates not just this hearing tomorrow. It adds a layer to this hearing, but it seriously complicates the tour's ability to, I think, get this deal safely down the road, because who's to say that Randall Stephenson isn't the leading edge of an opposition that exists out there that doesn't yet have a voice?
The only 2 voices that we had really heard on the PGA Tour side were Jay Monahan before he took his leave of absence, and Jimmy Dunne, and those 2 guys were on Golf Today and Golf Central back-to-back days on June 7th and June 8th. We hadn't heard a dissenting voice or fracture within the board. And there were only 4 people that really constructed this deal, as we know. Ed Hurley, who you mentioned, Jimmy Dunne, Jay Monahan, and Yasser on the Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia side. So the other board members, like Randall, were left in the dark. So I could only imagine the emotions for him, someone who's used to being in a position of power as a CEO with AT&T, to then be on the outside of the conversation and finding out secondhand what the future steps would be. I could see how that wouldn't necessarily sit well for him. I thought the alternative sources of capital line was compelling, because that's something we haven't heard if the PGA Tour resolutely has actually gone after and tried to deduce what other sources of capital they could have. It was just, let's mitigate the legal fees that we're dealing with. And plus, we have an abundant source of capital here. So while it may be the only one we're looking at, we're going to say that it's the best.
Yeah, and the tour does have to replace Randall Stephenson now. And it's easy to say, OK, well, they've got rid of a no vote on the board. But it's not quite that simple, because the non-player directors have to nominate someone they believe to be an acceptable replacement for Randall Stephenson, and that's going to have to win the approval of players. Those players are going to be wary of any attempt to kind of stack the deck in favour of a yes vote on this. But this all adds a lot of nuance to tomorrow's hearing, and we're going to be joined now by Jodi Balsam, sports law professor at Brooklyn Law School. Jodi, in terms of this Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations hearing tomorrow, what exactly is the jurisdiction of this committee and what are they attempting to accomplish?
Well, this Senate committee is responsible for studying and investigating, in the terms of its remit, the efficiency and economy of operations relating to all branches of government. So what does that mean? In recent years, they've had hearings to explore border security, cybersecurity, terrorism, the COVID-19 response, government waste and fraud. So this particular hearing about a merger in a private sector, professional golf, seems slightly outside their remit. However, I will point out that amongst their other recent hearings was a parallel investigation by this same committee into China's impact on education and scientific research in the United States. So they do have some jurisdiction to investigate where private industry will have an impact on the public well-being. And this kind of hearing is typically for information gathering in order to ultimately release some sort of report or inform some sort of legislation. So remember that the senators are lawmakers, not law enforcers. They can't charge a private business or individual like the PGA Tour or its executives with a crime or launch a civil enforcement proceeding against them. But they can use the hearing process to uncover facts, to issue a report, to inform a regulatory agency as to next steps that might be taken, or to introduce legislation to govern industry practices going forward.
Jodi, for the average viewer, you often see these Senate subcommittee hearings. It could be 6 hours boiled down to a 3-minute soundbite, and that's what just gets repeated play on the media afterwards. How much of it is grandstanding versus these hearings can actually definitively impact or fundamentally alter a change of course for a professional sports league going forward?
Well, I'll give you an example from a recent hearing into professional sports. You may remember just a year or so ago, a parallel House committee investigated the Washington Commanders, the former Washington Redskins football team, and the workplace issues that had come to light through some reporting in the press. And they had Roger Goodell, commissioner of the NFL, come testify for 2.5 hours. And it did seem to smack a little bit of political grandstanding, but they did ultimately issue a report and introduce legislation to curb the use of workplace non-disclosure agreements to better expose when workplaces become toxic. And here I could see them issuing some sort of report or making some sort of recommendation, but the way these hearings proceed is that each of the committee members has an opportunity to make a statement at the outset of their turn for questioning and then engage in some questioning of the witnesses. And I do anticipate there will be some ceremonial indignation expressed about the Saudis and their human rights abuses. This is an opportunity to make some political headlines, and that's probably what will show up in the debrief and the recaps as opposed to anything of substance.
Going to the stuff of substance beyond the performative theatrics that we're going to expect here, Jodi, are you anticipating that a lot of the questions will focus on antitrust concerns, drawing up a menu of sorts that the Department of Justice ought to be looking at in its separate investigation?
Well, interestingly, the letter from the committee chair, Senator Blumenthal, did not mention antitrust. It was focused primarily on the role of Saudi Arabia's public investment fund, the PIF, and the risks associated with the foreign government's investment in an American cultural institution and the ramifications on pro golf. So I would expect that what you'll hear from the questioning is the tour needs to explain the about face from their litigation position that PIF induced tour players to breach their contracts and join LIV. as to use golf to sports wash Saudi atrocities. They'll want an explanation about how the tour will maintain control over the sport and avoid negative associations and fan alienation. In the words of one senator, how will the tour preserve the purity of golf competition? Now, on the antitrust front, and one of the reasons why I'm not sure that will be a focus of tomorrow's hearing is that the ranking Republican member of the committee, Senator Ron Johnson, gave an interview last week that basically conceded there's nothing much the U.S. Congress can do about Saudi intent to invest in global sport, and that this investigation is not necessarily about antitrust. They're not concerned that there might be technical violations of U.S. antitrust law. What they're more concerned about is how do we make room for Saudi investment and preserve the purity of our sport.
Jodi, real quick, as we let you go, only one of the 4 deal architects are going to be there tomorrow. Is there a chance that we could have subsequent hearings in the future with Jay Monahan, Yasser, some of the other people that were actually in the room, like Ed Hurley as well?
So the requests for witness appearances in this case were for voluntary appearance. They have not yet issued any subpoenas, and the only volunteers who stepped up at the moment are Mr. Price and Mr. Dunn. Will the others who were requested to appear make that appearance? I doubt very much that a Saudi government official, such as Governor al-Rumayyan, will ever appear without compulsion, without a subpoena compelling him to appear. Will Greg Norman appear? Will Commissioner Monahan appear? Yes, it's possible that they will schedule additional hearing dates. We know the reason why Commissioner Monahan was unable to appear. It was health related. Given that the tour has allowed both Mr. Dunn and Mr. Price to appear, there's no reason why they wouldn't subsequently allow Commissioner Monahan to appear. As far as Greg Norman goes, that might depend on whether LIV even has a future in professional golf. How relevant is his testimony?
All right, Jodi, look forward to catching up with you tomorrow as we're going to be sitting at this desk for 8-9 hours watching the Senate subcommittee hearings unfold.